This right here is the gravestone of a vampire, Rachel Burton, who died here in Manchester, Vermont, all the way back in February of 1790. How do I know that Rachel was a vampire? Well, the answer to that question is kind of complicated. It starts in September of 1929, when the Vermont Historical Society received an unpublished manuscript in the mail from a woman named Mary C. Munson. The manuscript was a history of the town of Manchester, Vermont, written by a judge named John Pettibone. There was no date on the document and no real way to verify if Judge Pettibone was telling the truth, and until recently, Mary had just been holding on to the pages for the last 47 years. Despite its mysterious origin, though, the manuscript mostly covered basic information about Manchester, like dates of important events and biographies of prominent citizens, like that sort of thing, right? But hidden among the more grounded information in the manuscript was one story that kind of stuck out. A story about Rachel Burton here. See, Rachel actually died of tuberculosis, or consumption as it was known in those days. And after she died, her husband, Isaac Burton, married a second wife who unfortunately also came down with a serious case of tuberculosis just 3 years after Rachel died. So, of course, Isaac desperately wanted to save his second wife from the same grisly fate that had claimed his first, right? So Isaac, according to the manuscript, came back out to this cemetery, dug up Rachel's body back out of the earth, cut out her liver, heart, and lungs, and then burned the organs to ash at the local blacksmith shop. And that right there is how I know that Rachel Burton was a vampire. Or more accurately, an accused vampire. See, normally when you hear the words vampire hunting, you might imagine throwing holy water on creatures of the night and loading up guns with silver bullets, but here in New England, a vampire hunt is something very, very different. It's a search through old books and newspapers and archives for forgotten stories and shrouded references to an antique superstition. Clues in the hunt for New England's hidden network of vampire graves. All right, so before we get too deep into the video, I'm sure you got a couple of questions, right? Like, what does tuberculosis have to do with vampires? And why would Isaac Burton ever think that burning the heart of his first wife would somehow save his second wife? Well, to help answer those questions, let's move along to the next stop on our tour of New England's vampire graves, Jewett City, Connecticut, just a few hours south of Rachel's grave up in Manchester, Vermont. Down here in Jewett City are two brothers, Lemuel Ray and Elisha Ray, as well as their father, Henry Ray. The Ray family here were the subjects of a whole series of newspaper articles published all around New England back in the year 1854. Articles with titles like Strange Superstition, Burning the Dead. According to those articles, Lemuel, Elisha, and their father all died of consumption over the course of a few years in the 1840s and 50s, and then in 1854, a third unnamed brother also got sick with consumption. And this is where things might start to sound a little familiar. Apparently, some ignorant and superstitious neighbors got in the ear of that sick brother and convinced him that his dead relatives were responsible for the illness, that they were preying upon him, that the dead were literally feeding upon the living. And so, in order to find out for sure, a whole crowd of people came out to this cemetery and dug up the bodies of Lemuel and Elisha and their father, who at that point had all been dead for several years already. Reportedly, both the bodies of the dad and one of the two brothers, it's not specified which one, were in deep stages of decay, but the third brother had fresh blood in his heart, which seemingly was proof that they had found the culprit. So the crowd built a big bonfire inside one of these graves, lowered the coffin onto the flames, and burned the body into ash. And that is another classic example of a New England vampire story. For centuries, people around these parts believed that if someone in your family died of consumption and then you got sick, then your dead relative just might be sapping away your life force from beyond the grave. And thus, the only way to save yourself was to dig up your brother or mother or sister or whatever and make sure that they were really dead for good. If you know where to look, you can find tons and tons of references to this superstition from all throughout the local history. Like, just for example, here is a great article from an anthropology magazine in 1896 talking about how some New Englanders view consumption as a spiritual disease, that dead consumptive relatives drain the blood of the living into the heart of the dead. Or how about this, a newspaper article about superstitions from 1835, where the author says that they personally know of 3 or 4 bodies that have been dug up and had their organs burnt to ash. Believe it or not, this was a relatively pervasive belief back in the day. Some historians and folklorists have theorized that the whole idea is probably an ancient superstition that traveled across the Atlantic from Europe, but regardless of where the myth of the consumption vampire came from, New England is a hotbed of examples. So how about we go visit another? This time we'll head over to Cornwall, Connecticut, a couple hours west of Jewett City, and we'll visit Emily J. Ford, who is buried beneath a very faded family stone that also mentions her parents and a brother. Emily's story is very similar to the others that we've discussed so far. In January of 1869, Emily got sick and died of consumption, and then her brother also got sick not too long after. That brother was wasting away very, very quickly, so when a man from a neighboring town told the Ford family about the whole consumption vampire superstition, they latched onto the idea and immediately convinced a local doctor to come out to this cemetery and dig up Emily. Apparently, when the doctor cut out Emily's organs, enough fresh blood was found in the liver to thoroughly besmear the doctor's hands. And so, whoosh, there went all of Emily's organs, up in smoke, just like with the other 2 stories. According to one newspaper article I found, the brother's health started to improve after the ritual was completed, although I couldn't find anything myself to really confirm that. Which kind of leads me into a bit of a disclaimer that I feel like I better mention while we're on the subject. You know, we are dealing with a topic here that is heavily tinged with folklore and legend and myth, so I would encourage you not to think of anything that I talk about in this video as 100% inarguable fact, especially because we are relying on a whole lot of single sources and, stories that some journalists probably heard from a friend of a friend of a friend, right? But all right, let's move on to the next grave, where I'd like to point out a couple of strange commonalities in all these vampire stories that you might have already noticed on your own. So let's head up to Hatfield in central Massachusetts. And here we are, next to the grave of Martha Dickinson, who died in 1785. This is another story that comes to us in kind of a strange roundabout way. It starts with a letter that was written in 1788 by Martha's son-in-law, a reverend named Justice Forward. The reverend wrote this letter privately to a friend from a nearby town, and the only reason that I have a copy of it to read to you is because a newspaper in 1877 published a copy of the letter that apparently had been found among the possessions of a local doctor who had recently died. The newspaper does not at all explain how the doctor got the letter or why they are choosing to publish it. They just print it with zero additional commentary under the headline, "A Curious Letter," which is a bit of an understatement, I think, because immediately Reverend Forward starts off the letter by worrying that his daughter is being preyed upon by the dead. The Reverend had several relatives who had died of consumption over the last few years, and so now that his daughter has also caught the disease, he wants to start digging up his family and checking around for evidence. And so he decides to start with his mother-in-law, Martha here, who had already been dead for 3 years when the Reverend had her grave reopened. Also on the scene for that exhumation was a doctor who looked over the body and concluded that Martha was decomposing at a natural rate. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. So the Reverend decided that she clearly was not the one who was sucking the life out of his daughter, and he lowered her back into the earth to sleep peacefully once again. But since the Reverend had already gone through the trouble of digging up one family member, he thought that he might as well just keep looking. So next, he traveled from Hatfield, Massachusetts, over to nearby Belchertown, Massachusetts. And here in Belchertown, he dug up his daughter, Martha Dwight, who had been dead for 6 years when her coffin was reopened. And this time, the body was not quite as decayed as the Reverend expected. Apparently, Martha still had blood in her lungs and a relatively intact liver. So what the Reverend did was take the lungs and the liver and put them in a separate box and then rebury Martha's coffin with the little organ box sitting right on top of it, separated from the rest of the body, which I guess is apparently just as valid a way to stop the consumption as burning the organs. The Reverend did admit, though, that he really wasn't all that experienced with digging up graves and with corpse decomposition timelines, so he really wasn't exactly sure what to make of the whole experience. But okay, now that we've heard 4 different vampire stories, there's a couple of common features in these narratives that I want to point out to you. The first being that none of these stories have actually used the word vampire. And in fact, as we go through the rest of these graves, you'll notice that that word rarely comes up. Like every once in a while, a source might say vampire, but for the most part, the idea that a dead consumption victim is gonna leech the life out of their family is sort of like its own isolated little piece of folklore that just so happens to very heavily resemble the more traditional idea of a Dracula type vampire. And also, it's worth noting that I'm not even close to the first person to recognize this either. Like, even way back in the 1800s, people were talking about how New England has like its own little regional vampire mythology that never actually uses the term vampire. And I think that that is especially interesting in conjunction with the second observation that I want to point out to you, which is that all of these stories are ridiculously vague about how exactly these dead family members are supposed to be killing their relatives. Like, I imagine this is the one that you've probably noticed on your own. Like, are these corpses supposed to be rising from the grave at night and sucking the blood of their sister or brother? Or are they using some kind of like mystical power to draw blood from their family members without ever actually leaving the grave? Like, rarely, if ever, are we given any kind of clear mechanism behind how this whole thing is supposed to work? Like, let's just real quickly run back through all the graves that we've already seen and look specifically at how each story describes the life-draining process. Back up in Manchester, Vermont, where we started, all it says is that the family was induced to believe that if the vitals of the first wife could be consumed by being burned in a charcoal fire, it would effect a cure of the second wife. And that is it. Like, how exactly that was supposed to cure the second wife is not explained at all. And back in Jewett City, the newspaper said that the dead were supposed to feed upon the living, without describing exactly how the dead were feeding on the living. And over in Cornwall, there was a sort of vital current existing between the living and the dead, where somehow the victim's blood was being transported into the organs of their dead relative, but we don't actually get an explanation of how that was happening. And back up here in Belchertown, the Reverend was looking for signs that the dead were preying on the living, without actually describing how the dead were preying on the living. So for the most part, the actual supernatural clockwork at play here is kind of just left up to your imagination, which for me kind of just makes the whole thing feel more compelling, because people were actually out here digging up their relatives and carving up corpses based on an incredibly loose and hazy superstition. I think, if anything, this really just goes to show you how desperate a lot of these people were to save either themselves or their family members from consumption. They were willing to try anything, even if it didn't make a lot of intuitive sense. But hey, I think by now you've probably got the basics of how these vampire stories typically work, right? Someone dies of consumption and then their relative also gets sick, and so the person who died is dug back up and their organs are either destroyed or separated from their body somehow. So with that in mind, how about we go and visit some vampire graves that add a little twist to the standard template. So to start us off, let's move back up north to Dummerston, Vermont. Up here in Dummerston, we have a whole family of vampires to talk about. These are the children of Captain Leonard Spaulding, who is buried in another cemetery just about 2 miles away from here. There's 6 children in total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. According to an old history book on the town of Dummerston, throughout the late 1700s, almost all of Captain Spaulding's children here died of consumption in their 20s and 30s, and each one was laid to rest in a row here in this cemetery. And believe it or not, this side-by-side burial method is actually where the twist comes into play with this particular vampire story. See, apparently, some people in Dummerston thought that if a bunch of people who died of consumption were all buried in a row, side by side, then a vine or a root might start growing on one end of the row, and slowly the vine would snake its way through all the graves, one at a time, growing underground. And when the vine eventually reached the last coffin in the row, then a new family member would die of consumption. So here comes the evil vine growing underground, and just past the first coffin. There's the second, there's the third, here it comes, there's the fourth, the fifth, and boom, a new family member is now gonna die from consumption. And so the only way to stop the killer consumption vine was to dig up the body of the last relative, preemptively before the vine could get to it, and then burn the organs of the corpse. And that is exactly what the people of Dummerston did with Captain Spaulding's kids here. They dug up the last body and they burned the vital organs, trying to break the chain. No word on if they actually found an evil vine snaking from grave to grave, though. All right, next up, for another twist on the basic consumption vampire story, let's real quick take a stop over here in Wynne Hall, Connecticut. On September 29th, 1859, a very short article appeared in a Vermont newspaper saying that the wife of Prescott Lawrence of Wynne Hall had recently died, and so her family cut out her organs and burned them to try and save any other relatives from getting sick. Now, I'm not actually 100% confident that I have the right grave on this one, but right here is Clarissa Lawrence, who is the only woman with the last name Lawrence that I could find buried here in Wynne Hall that actually matches up to the timeline from the article. because that article was published on September 29th, and it said that Mrs. Lawrence died a few days ago, and Clarissa here died on September 27th. So I think there's a good chance that this is the right headstone here. But anyway, the real reason that this one is so interesting to me is because the article says that Mrs. Lawrence had her organs cut out and burned just a few days after she died, which probably means that she hadn't even been buried yet when they did that, which is sort of an interesting variation to the story, right? Like, instead of waiting for a family member to get sick and then digging up your relative who died 2 years ago, we're just gonna like go ahead and preemptively burn the organs right now. Like, before we even bury the body, we're just gonna get in there and we're gonna nip this problem in the bud before it starts. Just get ahead of things before it becomes an issue. All right, next up, let's go up to Woodstock, Vermont and discuss one of my favorite vampire stories from the whole batch. And right off the bat, you'll notice on this one that we're not in a cemetery. We're actually at the Woodstock Green, right smack dab in the middle of town. My original plan for this one was to tell you the story from the Woodstock Green, but the day that I went up to Woodstock to film, there was actually a craft fair taking place on the town green. So instead, I'm going to tell the story from this log. So, this vampire comes to us from an article that the Boston Evening Transcript published on September 6th of 1890. And in that article, a journalist interviews a woman from Woodstock who has a very strange story to tell about the Woodstock Green. According to the woman, back around 1835, a man died from consumption, and then the man's brother got sick a few months later. So the body of the dead guy was dug up, the family cut out his heart, and they discovered that it was still full of liquid blood, which, as I'm sure you know by now, was the telltale sign that they were on the right track. So the townsfolk reburied the body and then carried the heart to the Woodstock Green, where they burned it to ash in an iron pot. The old woman swore that she saw all of this take place with her own eyes. But as interesting as all that is, the real story is just beginning. See, about a month after that Boston article was written, the Vermont Standard, based right here in Woodstock, published a response article in which they helped the recollections of the old lady and added some more detail to the story. Like, to start us off, according to the article, the events took place specifically in June of 1830, and the name of the man whose grave was dug up was Corwin. The article also specifies a cemetery where the body was supposedly buried, but unfortunately, I could not find any graves in that cemetery with the name Corwin. But that's okay, because the real interesting stuff in this article is all the extra detail added to the story of the heart being burned in an iron pot on the town green. Supposedly, that heart-burning ritual was actually officiated by the town selectmen and witnessed by a crowd of onlookers. Like, this was a whole big spectacle taking place right in the center of town. And what's more, after the heart was burned to ash, the townsfolk dug a great big hole in the town green, lowered the iron pot with the ashes into it, and then put a 7-ton block of granite on top of the pot and filled in the grave with dirt. So if you believe this article, somewhere under this pleasant little craft fair is the toasted heart of a vampire in an iron pot with a giant block of stone sitting on top of it. But even then, we're still not done with this story. We got one more little epilogue. Because according to this article, a few years after the pot was buried, some curious townsfolk came back out to the town green and tried to dig up the makeshift grave. Supposedly, they got about 15 feet down into the earth without finding anything, before a mysterious roaring noise and the smell of sulfur scared them into filling the hole back in. And if that's not enough, the ground reportedly shook and rumbled for several days afterward, with smoke seeping out of the earth where the hole had been dug. So far and away, this is the most supernatural type story that we've encountered so far. All the others kind of seem like historical accounts of people acting on a superstition, but this one is written much more in the style of a folktale or a legend. Next, let's mosey on down to North Cumberland, Rhode Island, and visit a very unique gravestone. This is Simon Whipple, who has one of the more famous graves on the entire tour, mostly because this one actually says vampire on the tombstone. Like, just look at this inscription here. Most of the words nowadays are buried underground, but you can still very clearly read the top two lines. Although consumption's vampire grasp had seized thy mortal frame. So that's pretty cool, right? A New England vampire grave that actually says vampire. Well, the problem is that those lines on the inscription there were probably taken from a poem written in 1838 to the memory of an abolitionist who had died of consumption. Like, just look at this. Here's an excerpt from the poem lined up with the gravestone. Thus, though consumption's vampire grasp had seized thy mortal frame, thy ardent and aspiring mind untouched remained the same. So I don't know about you, but to me, the fact that this isn't a unique inscription means that the headstone is probably more likely a reference to the consumption vampire stuff, like in general, rather than an indication that Simon specifically was accused of being a vampire. Especially because, as far as I'm aware, there is no evidence that Simon was ever exhumed or that his heart was ever burned or anything like that. In my opinion, this is a headstone that's related to the vampire graves, but probably not one itself. All right, next up, let's stay in Rhode Island and head over to Exeter for another example of a story that adds a whole bunch of additional supernatural elements to the traditional consumption vampire narrative. This time, instead of a relatively well-maintained graveyard, we're at a tiny cemetery with only a few visible grave markers. If I didn't know that this place was here, I probably could have just walked right by without even noticing. It's just barely visible from the road. I'll tell you why we're at such a hidden little cemetery in a moment, but first, we gotta talk about an article that was printed in a literary magazine back in 1888. The article is all about the consumption vampire superstition in Rhode Island, and specifically, it tells the story of an apple orchard owner that the magazine just calls Stukely, or Snuffy Stuke. Stukely and his wife had 14 children together throughout the late 1700s, most of whom lived to early adulthood without much trouble, until one fateful night when Stukely had a dream that half of the trees in his apple orchard died. And soon after that dream, Stukely's eldest daughter, Sarah, got sick and died of consumption. And then, as I'm sure you can predict by now, another daughter very shortly after also came down with consumption. This time though, there's something new to the story. This is where that supernatural stuff starts to come into play. That newly sick daughter, suffering from consumption, began to complain that every night Sarah, her dead sister, would climb through the window and sit on top of her, causing great pain and misery. Despite that horrifying image though, Stukely could do nothing to save his daughter. All he could do was sit by and watch as one after the other, 6 members of his family fell prey to consumption, with each and every one of them complaining that late at night, Sarah would come a-knocking at their window. When Stukely's wife and 7th child began to complain about visions of Sarah though, Stukely decided that enough was enough. He had to do something. And so, he got together a big crowd of his neighbors, and one by one, they dug up the coffins of the 6 relatives who had already died. 5 of the corpses were already in deep stages of decomposition, but the 6th was different. Sarah, the first child to pass away, reportedly had arteries and a heart filled with fresh blood. Her hair and nails looked as if they had grown since she had been laid to rest. And most remarkably, Her eyes were wide open and fixed, staring straight ahead, right back at those who had exhumed her body. And that was enough for Stukely. Clearly, Sarah was a vampire, right? So he had her heart cut out and burned, and apparently that solved the problem. Kinda. The son, who was already sick with consumption, still passed away, but after that, the family was safe. So obviously, this story comes across a whole lot more like a legend or a folk tale than it does a historical account, right? Like even more so than that one with the iron pot that we talked about up in Vermont. The cool thing though with this one is even though the story has clearly been dramatized over the years, it's still founded in some real history. About 30 years ago, a folklorist named Michael Bell uncovered that there actually was a guy named Stukely who lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, who had 14 kids. Stukely Tillinghast, to be exact. And this is the cemetery where Stukely Tillinghast and a lot of his family were buried. The sad thing though is that, as you can see, a lot of the headstones seem to be missing nowadays, including Stukely himself. Although his wife, Honor Tillinghast, still has a clearly legible stone. Interestingly though, for some reason, the headstone says that the name of Honor's husband is Stutley instead of Stukely, although all the old town records that I found clearly say that the wife of Honor Tillinghast is named Stukely Tillinghast. So I guess that is just another strange little wrinkle to the story. There's also a lot of unmarked field stones in this cemetery with no names or inscriptions that could very well be the children that died of consumption. Like this one here, for example, has an ST engraved on it that could be Sarah Tillinghast, that first child who is thought to be the vampire. Although it also just could be Stukely himself or really anybody else whose first name started with an S. All right, so finally, after traveling all around New England, I only got one last vampire grave to tell you about, which might come as a surprise, because obviously there's still a whole bunch of markers on this map that we haven't talked about yet, right? Well, those are actually vampire stories where I either couldn't identify or couldn't access an associated gravestone because it was on private property or something. So what I'm gonna do is real quick, rapid fire, run through all these extra vampire stories that don't have headstones. Starting with Nancy Young in Foster, Rhode Island. We got pretty much the standard story here. Nancy gets sick and she dies of consumption in 1827, and then her siblings also start getting sick, so the family digs up Nancy and burns her body. The one major twist with this one though is that apparently Nancy's family actually stood around her burning corpse and inhaled the fumes of the body, thinking that that would be the thing that cures their consumption. Next, we got a history book from 1878 on the town of Westerly, Rhode Island, that says that a black man named Bristow Congdon dug up and burned the heart of one of his children at some point in Westerly's history. I could not find any headstones to go along with this one, unfortunately. Here's a kind of funny one. In 1869, a newspaper in Boston published a short article that said, "The body of a young man in New Hampshire has just been dug up and his heart cut out and burned because of an old superstition that doing so would save his brother from consumption." And then a few days later, a New Hampshire newspaper responded by saying, no, actually, that didn't happen up here in New Hampshire. You're thinking of Hampshire County, Massachusetts. Just wanted to clear that up for you. Either way, I have no idea who or what family they were talking about. Moving along, a book about consumption in New England from 1862 briefly touches on the experiences of a doctor who used to work up in Saco, Maine. The doctor is trying to make a point that people who live on like wet, swampy land tend to be more vulnerable to consumption than people who live on dry land. And part of his argument for that thesis is that he personally has witnessed a lot of consumption victims being dug up for superstitious reasons. And generally, the doctor noticed that there was a lot of water in those graves. I actually love this one just because of how the doctor is kind of glossing over the fact that people were digging up graves. Like, to him, the important part here is that water was in the graves, which confirms his theory. And why people were actually digging up corpses is just like this afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, people around here, they just dig up graves sometimes, but dude, there was water in those graves when they do. All right, here is a kind of personal one. Literally years ago now, I found this article from 1915 talking about how there was once a weird ceremony performed in a cemetery in West Stafford, Connecticut. And the article goes on to explain a pretty basic consumption vampire story regarding a family that isn't named. So at the time, when I first found this, I just kind of saved a copy of it as like this bizarre occult story that maybe I'll have to look into one day. And it wasn't until a few months ago when I started working on this video that I was like, hey, wait a minute, didn't I see something very similar to this like 2 years ago? And so I opened up this article again, and lo and behold, there's a consumption vampire story that I came across years before I even knew what a consumption vampire was. Next up, in 1872, a guy named William Rose dug up and burned the bodies of both his son and daughter in Peacedale, Rhode Island, but I couldn't find gravestones for either one, which is kind of a shame because this is actually one of the most widely reported on stories that I came across in the entire video. Like, I found articles about William Rose and his accused vampire children from literally all across the country, and even one from New Zealand. All right, here we got a pretty bizarre one. This is an article from 1871 about a guy from Pennsylvania who is apparently advertising in the newspapers that he's gonna dig up his family members who died of consumption and go through the whole ritual to save his other relatives. Which, I know this isn't New England, but this one is just too crazy to leave out of the video. Like, literally advertising in the papers that you're gonna dig up some corpses so that a bunch of people can come watch you light your dead sister's heart on fire or whatever. Like, this is just such an impossible thing to ever imagine happening nowadays. This advertisement is also a really great segue to talk about a few consumption vampires that aren't from New England, like how this one is from Pennsylvania. Because, you know, even though the consumption vampire myth is definitely at its highest concentration in this region, every once in a while they make an appearance from somewhere else in the country. Like, here's one from Chicago, for example. I also got a couple from New York State, although both of these are like just over the border, so it's pretty much still culturally the same region. This first one is a pretty basic consumption vampire story from Grafton, New York, but the second is real weird. Remember that old lady from up in Woodstock, Vermont, who originally told the story of the Iron Pot vampire? Well, she actually told the journalist a second story that I haven't told you about yet. This one isn't really a vampire story, but it's close enough and strange enough that I just want to show you anyway. So, according to that woman, her uncle used to be a doctor over in Malone, New York, and one day a bone auger was observed to be growing out of the ground at the town cemetery, and every day the bone auger continued to grow taller and taller, and so eventually the woman's uncle and some other people dug down under the bone auger and found a coffin with a dead body inside, and the bone auger was growing right out of the heart of the corpse. This one is just so bizarre because what the heck is a bone auger? Like, even the newspaper doesn't seem to know because they literally keep putting the term in quotes. Like, I cannot even imagine what this is supposed to mean other than a literal auger made of bone growing up into the sky like a tree. Like, this one is just impossible to even picture. But okay, I think it's just about time we talk about our last grave. So let's head back to Exeter, Rhode Island. This here is the grave of Mercy Brown, who is undoubtedly the most famous out of all the New England vampires, which you can see for yourself just by looking at this very elaborate shrine that's kind of developed around her grave. Like, if you knew anything about any of these stories before clicking on the video, it was gonna be this one. There are tons and tons of YouTube videos and blog posts and like all sorts of stuff already out there about Mercy Brown. But all that said, here's the weird thing. Despite being far and away the most famous New England vampire, Mercy's story is really not that unique. And in fact, it's pretty much just the standard consumption vampire story. Like, check out this newspaper article from Providence that reports the whole event without a lot of dramatization. In January of 1892, Mercy Brown died of consumption, and then her brother also got sick, so George Brown, their father, had Mercy dug up, and then he cremated her heart and liver. And that is just about it. Modern accounts of this story tend to add in a whole bunch of extra stuff about how you can like hear Mercy's ghost calling out to you if you stand in the right spot or whatever. But for the most part, this really isn't anything out of the ordinary from the standard consumption vampire template. Like, this Providence article here even says that the doctor who cut out Mercy's heart said that nothing really seemed abnormal about the body. They kinda just burned the heart and liver just in case, rather than because they genuinely believed that Mercy was a vampire. So why did this grave, out of all the ones that we've covered, become so famous? Well, if you wanna know my opinion, I think it's because of the date. Mercy Brown was dug up in 1892, which is quite a bit after all those other stories. Like, the next most recent grave exhumation that we've talked about was William Rose, which happened in 1872, a whole 20 years before Mercy was dug up. So by the time of this exhumation, the whole vampire superstition was kind of beginning to fade away, and that, I'm guessing, just made this particular narrative feel a whole lot more weird and newsworthy, which is especially evidenced by the huge amount of articles that spread all across the country covering this story. Like, people were really, really shocked to hear that somebody would actually do this in 1892. Like, just to really hammer home and put into perspective how relatively modern this was, in 1892, Stalin was already 14 years old, and FDR was already 10, and Picasso was 11, and Colonel Sanders from KFC was already 2 years old. Like, from what I've read, I kind of think the consumption vampire was always a somewhat fringe superstition. But by 1892 especially, it was considered to be very, very antiquated. Which kind of makes this bonus story, this secret story that I'm about to tell you, feel even more bizarre. Yeah, I got one last quick little extra story for you that I think is perfect for closing out the video, one that I've been saving. I found this in a Connecticut newspaper that was printed in 1916, 24 years after Mercy Brown's grave was exhumed. And in this article, a doctor from Hartford says that he had recently been treating a young Sicilian woman who had come down with tuberculosis, which already is a huge indication that we are well into a more modern age here. Finally, they're calling the disease tuberculosis instead of consumption. But anyway, this woman was relatively sick, but still not really in danger of losing her life yet. And so the doctor wanted to send her out to New Mexico for treatment. But instead, the woman wanted to do something different. She wanted to go back to Sicily because she had 2 sisters buried there that had died of consumption. The doctor, unsurprisingly, really had no idea what that had to do with anything, so he pleaded with the woman to please just go and get proper treatment in New Mexico. And eventually, after about a month of effort, the woman agreed. And at first, the doctor was pretty proud of himself. You know, he thought that he had finally persuaded her. But no, the reason that the woman changed her mind was because she had received a letter in the mail from her priest back in Sicily. Apparently, when the woman first got sick, she wrote a letter back home explaining that she had tuberculosis. And so, her priest went to the local cemetery, dug up the woman's sisters, and burned their lungs to ash. Not long after, the woman went out to New Mexico, where reportedly she recovered just fine. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.